Hello, great that you can join me for another visual effects tutorial video. In this tutorial video, we will explore how to create a nuclear bomb effect. We're using two of our plugins, thinkingParticles and finalFluid. I will explain in detail how I set up this effect here. Let me just bring up the effect. So we have this nuclear bomb falling down and creating this beautiful mushroom cloud effect and rising up into the sky, and as it rises it cools down and creates this beautiful nuclear bomb effect. Before we do that, let me just do a little disclaimer. So all we do here is a non-scripted tutorial, so everything you see here, every parameter I change is live, so you will see the real results as if you were working with your own 3D Studio Max version and our plugin. Second, I would like you to press the subscribe and like button and also the bell button. That helps us a lot in spreading the tutorial video to other 3D Studio Max users. Thank you for doing that, and now let's just dive right into 3D Studio Max and set up this effect. Before we look into the actual visual effect setup, let's have a look at the scene and what we have here. So in this scene, we have a pretty standard scene, nothing spectacular. We have one light, a camera, we have a surface, and some helper objects. So let me just start exploring the helper objects. The first helper object is this cylinder, which is hidden right now. And the cylinder object is, let me just put that in full screen here. So here we have the full screen. So that's my rocket or my bombs, so to say. So I used standard 3D Studio Max tools to model this bomb, and it also has an exhaust with a noise controller. So that creates our rocket exhaust. So that's the mesh we will use in our particle system to create the bomb flying down into the ground. The next helper object we have here, let me just turn that on, is a second cylinder, and let me just look from the top. Here is our cylinder. We have a selected face. Let me just zoom in from the side. We have a selected surface, and that face is used or will be used to emit particles, and I will explain what we need that for. And the last helper object we have here is our dummy object. Let me just move again on the side view. Here's our dummy object, and in the center of the dummy object we have our rocket here. So we use this dummy object to position our rocket. So if I move around the dummy object, the rocket will also move around. The rest is our finalFluid setup, the emitters and the grid. I will talk in detail in this tutorial about the setup and how we get our mushroom cloud effect. Then we have some lights, cameras, and our surface, the plane as well. Let me just highlight the plane here. That's our surface, and also spotlights and thinkingParticles and a wind force. So now that we have all explained, so these are all objects we have in the scene here. And now we are going to bring up our thinkingParticles. However, let me just explain, I'm not going too deep in thinkingParticle setups because you could use any particle system to recreate this effect. So this is more about finalFluid and how to get the mushroom effect. However, I'll show you what setup we have, and I'll explain why we did the setup in the way we did it. So let me just go and open thinkingParticles. So now what we have here is our thinkingParticles user interface. And the first thing, let me just move up here and close the other dynamic sets. My first dynamic set, and I'll rename that, is the create dynamic set. So my first dynamic set is creating the actual mesh of the bomb as a particle. So how do I do that? First thing, I'll get the dummy object, which we had here. Let me just turn it on again. That's a dummy object. So we get the position from the dummy object in our particle generator. So we grab the position of the dummy object, and in the center of the dummy, we create one particle, pistol shot. So we create one particle, we align it along the movement direction or direction of travel. So our tip of the bomb is always pointed to the right direction and not the other way around. And then we assign our rocket mesh, which I showed you, that's the cylinder 2, to this particle we created. So the particle is created in the rockets group. We have the particle group rockets. And then we grab the particle in the rockets group and assign the geometry. So that means we are now doing the mesh of the bomb I created there. So that's our first setup. So create the bomb, and that's it. Also, the only motion we create for our bomb is a downward motion. So we have a direction downward -1 in the z-axis, and we'll give it a speed of 200. That's all, nothing else. The next, but first, we get our plane. So that's our surface, and we use a universal deflector. So we get our collision as a Boolean out. So is there a collision? Then we get a flag 1, and then we can react to it. And we get also the position of the collision. Where did the collision happen on the surface of the plane? We get these two things out, and when we have a collision, we activate our particle born and we create a new particle at the position of the impact, so that we know where the impact happens. And our new explosion system just needs a position, that's all, and it creates the explosion. You can set up the explosion. I explained that in a separate tutorial video with the water bombs or the explosion, the dust explosion tutorial, or the water bombs, as I already mentioned. So check out those videos if you want to know how our explosion tool works. So now that we have the position, we get our explosion there, and I have another setup here, and that's a kind of a little trick I'm using here. I'm daisy chaining 2 egg timers. So what I'm doing here, when there's a collision, so when our bomb hits the ground, I'll start a timer for 15 frames. And when this is reached, so after 15 frames, I'll start another timer. And this timer runs for 100 frames. And then for 100 frames, I generate 1,000 particles per second. So why do I do that? Why wait for 15 frames and then run for 100 frames? Let me just show you how this effect is set up. So let's just play back the effect. So we can see, let me just stop here before we hit the ground. So here we will hit the ground. And when we hit the ground, watch what happens. We have our explosion. The expansion is happening. So we have the explosion going on. And after 15 frames, something else will happen. So now we have these particles from our meta waves, the circle, the second circle I told about, where we selected the top surface, we emit particles that just rise up. And these particles are meant to simulate the sucking effect of the nuclear explosion. Because it's so hot, it's hot as the sun, all the air is sucked in and rises up and creates these wonderful vortex clouds that rise up. This is meant to simulate just the sand and the debris sucked up in the center core or the stem of our mushroom cloud. So this is why I just want to explain one more. So first we have our explosion happening, and I want to wait at least 15 frames in that setup. Because what we do with our explosion setup is we plant the fuel, and the fuel is exploding, expanding, and that takes time. So we don't want to have the soil rising at the same time. The soil is sucked up when the mushroom starts to build. So this is why we have to wait 15 frames or whatever, how we set up the timing then. So and then we start with our stem of the mushroom cloud. So that's a little trick I use there. But besides of that, we have all straightforward here. The other thing that's happening is we have a shock wave as well. we use this shockwave ring. And this shockwave is meant to simulate two things. It's meant to simulate the pressure change in the air. So this is this wobbly thing in the air that happens. And we also want to push away some dust particles or particles in the air that look like it. Let me just bring back the animation so that we can see. Here's the shockwave, and that just gives the impression that there's pressure going on or pressure building up. And so that's what we want to achieve with this effect. So, but as I mentioned, we can use any particle system that or any tool in 3D Studio Max that creates particles. We're just using thinkingParticles because it's, in my opinion, the best particle system you can get for 3D Studio Max, especially when you're about procedural visualization or procedural visual effects. So let's have a look here at the setup. Here we are going to have a look at the settings for our fluid grid. Most of it is basic stuff, but let's just go over it. So we have a cell size for our grid to have a certain resolution of our effect. Then the size of our grid where everything happens. We set our memory limit and we set our gravity as well. We want to have gravity because we are working with buoyancy. In our effect, I only want to have, and that's just one way I set up this effect, but I want to have a physically accurate effect where the heat is the driver of everything. So hot air moves up. So that means the buoyancy effect with hot air is creating our whole dynamic of the mushroom cloud rising up into the sky. Then we have down here our big effect setting. Let me just set that to a reasonable value here. And that's practically it. We have our emitters. Let me just close that. We picked all our emitters in here and we will jump back and forth with the emitters. And then we have all our other setups. So let me just start the simulation here in the real-time viewport. And here we have our real-time viewport and we can see the shockwave and our mushroom cloud is rising up into the sky. So that's our setup. But let's analyze what we have here. Let me just select the bomb setup and I'll turn off the bomb setup. So now we only have the shockwave and our ground soil sucking up effect. So let me just also turn off the shockwave. So I'll turn off the shockwave as well. And now we only have our ground soil sucking up simulation. And as you can see in here, it's a very simple, straightforward simulation. And also the particles, they just rise, nothing special here. We could have done a more conical shape that works like this and sucks from the outer areas. But because I'm lazy, I just did that. It was easy. So that gives us the impression that extra material, debris, dust and stuff is sucked up with the mushroom cloud. And then, as I said, we have our shockwave. Let me turn on the shockwave again. And that's our shockwave effect. But I'll leave the shockwave off for now. And I'll just turn on our bomb, our actual nuclear bomb effect. And now we are going to explore how did we set up this effect. So this is first thing, this is a particle emission. So we create, I think, 1,000 particles for our actual bomb expanding. So we use particles, we pick our particle system, thinkingParticles, and the particle group expansion where we create the particles. So that's all. We make sure that we use particles to put our fuel and smoke in there. So what do we put in these voxels or at the positions of the particles? We put in smoke. So I want to have a base smoke there that just lingers around. Then I want to create heat. So heat means we ignite our fuel right away. And to make sure that I get the maximum heat, and right now you can set whatever you want as your maximum heat. So that's just arbitrary. So right now I like to have everything between 0 and 1. However, there's no rule that you can't have 0 and 1,000, 0 and a 10,000 or a million. Whatever you feel comfortable. But right now I'll have 0 and 1. And later in the shader, I map this 0 to 1. I map this to 0 to 2000 degrees centigrade or 4000 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever you want. So 0 and 1, 1 means for me maximum heat, whatever that means. So the next thing is I have a couple rate of 100. So I want, when I create this voxel, I just want to have the heat right away. I don't want to have the heat built up over several frames. I just want, when it's created, give me maximum heat. That's the nuclear explosion. When the chain reaction happens in the bomb, it's hot. It's hotter than the sun. So that's the setup. And same deal with fuel. I want to have fuel because without fuel, we can't burn anything. So I need to have our fuel there, our radioactive material. And the more, the bigger the explosion, less fuel, smaller the explosion. So let's have a play around with that. So I'll reduce the amount of fuel to 20. And now we see we just get barely an explosion because we don't have enough material to burn or explode. So other way around, if I have too much, so I increased it now, I doubled it from my setting, I get a huge explosion now, a huge mushroom cloud. So if I go back to 100, I get my nice mushroom cloud effect. However, it's up to you. It's a matter of taste, how you want to have your look of the mushroom cloud. So fuel, temperature is the most important part here. And the same deal here. My couple rate is pretty high for the fuel because I want the full fuel at the instant we create the voxels in our grid, in our domain. The next thing is the ranges. And that controls how big is the particle, how many voxels will we use to fill with fuel. So I could just make this smaller, so minimum and maximum active distance. So now I made it very small, and that means we can't pump much fuel into the area, into our volume. So we have less fuel there, even though we didn't change the amount of fuel. But the volume we have available is very small. So that also creates some interesting effects. However, when I go to the extreme, so I'll give every particle has a huge area now. Now we can burn a huge area and we get this large mushroom cloud rising up. So let me just put that back. So keep that in mind. And then we also have these other controls like the distance, shape distance multiplier. So that's just a multiplier of our size of the particle. When I go smaller, let's say 0.1, we have very small things, and then we get very strange effect. So usually it's a good idea to keep that multiplier at 1. You can also increase it. That has different effects, but for now, just keep it at the default 1. The next control in our bomb effect is the velocities. We didn't do anything there. I don't want to have any velocities. We could have an extra push up, and I'll show you here. So I'll just do an artificial blowing up when we create the voxels. So now we have an initial boost, and we push up the whole thing into the air. You could set up the whole effect just with these artificial things, but I rather want to have the actual physical correct effect with using the heat as our buoyancy and effect that drives our mushroom effect. Okay, so that's the emitter setup. Because the emitter is a global emitter, that means all the other settings of how we burn and how things are happen in our global settings. And in the global settings, the most important part is vorticity. And it's very important that you take care or pay attention to vorticity. I'll turn off the vorticity now to 0. That practically turns it off. And now we get no definition in our mushroom cloud. So it's more like a gas we have now. And that might be the perfect setting for these condensation rings that happen in a nuclear explosion, where you have just smooth condensation clouds around the nuclear explosion. So if we combine these effects, we could create probably the condensation rings very easily and efficient. So that creates a really nice looking effect. Vorticity is the effect that all our thousands of voxels we create, or 100,000s of voxels we create there to simulate our flow and vortices and all this, that drives everything. It spreads the heat around, it spreads the smoke around. Smoke is cold, so that cools down little cells, and all these organic things going on is responsible for our natural looking rolling cloud effect, or vortex cloud effect. So why not increase the vorticity? Now let me just increase the vorticity. When you overdo it, you mess around, you spread everything around, it cools down, burns in an instant. So too high of a value just creates very unnatural effects. So make sure that you keep these vorticities in a reasonable amount. But the great thing is it's real time, so you can see right away what's too much, what's too less. And you can apply vorticity to the velocity part, to the temperature mask, to the smoke, and fuel. All aspects can have these extra vorticity to spread around the stuff. So right now I just have these settings, and let's move on to the advection. That's another important aspect to control the look and behavior of our fluid effect. So let me start with ignition temperature. We ignore that. We want ignition right away. So the low value is totally fine for us right now. So what we want to have is burn per temperature. What does that mean? This controls how much fuel we burn from the beginning. So let's say I want to burn right away 50% of the fuel we have. What that means is we create an intense heat right away because we burn everything that's there. So that's like a nuclear explosion. So that will create a really extreme effect. When I go the other way, we have so much fuel left until it is burned. It takes forever to burn our effect. So that's the other extreme. So keeping it in a reasonable ways for the effect you want to achieve. That's my mushroom cloud I want to have. That controls the effect. Let's move on to the next, fuel per burn. So that means when a burn happens, so fuel, as I mentioned above here, burn per temperature, we have a lot of fuel left. So, and that ignites again, ignites again, ignites again, until it's burned and all is smoke. So when everything is smoke, all is done, we have nothing more to burn. So that just tells me I need so much fuel to create a burn. So if I increase this value, let me just increase that to 5. That means I need at least 5 fuel left to create a burning effect. And you can see the effect right away. Even if I increase it more, it's like all fuel is gone. We can't create more burning. But if I say the opposite way, hey, I just need a little bit to create a burn, then we will have a lot of fuel to burn along our way. Still fuel left, still fuel left, fuel left, fuel left. So we have a very long, long burn. So if I just dial it up a little bit, and that helps us to control how fast things happen, how much is burned along the way, And all these parameters balance the speed, the flow, and the shape of our mushroom cloud. The next thing is the temperature per burn. So what we could do is we could, when a burn happens, so when the remaining fuel is ignited again, that's a burn, we can increase the temperature. So when a new burn happens, we can say, okay, you burn twice as hot. So now we are adding more energy into our system. And now when a burn happens, we have more energy. And that means we have more expansion, more speed rising up because higher temperatures and so on. And we can do that to a point where it doesn't make any difference anymore. So at some point you're so hot, it has reached its maximum expansion value and so on. So, but I like to keep that at 1, like our initial energy, maximum heat, because heat on its own is adding up. So more voxel means we have heat adding up. So I want to keep it at a value of 1. The next thing is the smoke per burn. So when we burn fuel, usually we want to have some smoke generated. Because if we don't, then it's like a clean gas burn. So just the gas burns and we have no smoke. So if I would put that to 0, we only get the smoke we had in our emitter initially, and that's it. The burning will not create any more smoke. So usually you want to have smoke as well, at least in our setup like here. And then we get this nice mushroom cloud effect again here. So the expansion is the pressure we get from heat. When we have extreme heat in a voxel, it wants to expand. So heat is our expansion, and only heat creates expansion. Right now, you don't see expansion anymore down here. Here we have still a little bit of warmth left, and then we can get a little bit of expansion. But down here, there's no expansion at all. Only here when we have some heat left. So we can overdo this effect. Let me just do that. 10. So now we have a massive expansion. So that's way overdone, I would say. So I'll keep it around here. So that's a nice mushroom cloud I get here. So, and as I mentioned, our next parameter is the buoyancy. I want to have buoyancy as my driving force. Physically accurate heat rises up. That's all. And cold smoke is not rising or falling. So it's just lingering in the air and drifting along if we had a wind or whatever force. So that is the buoyancy effect. So let me just show you. When I reduce the buoyancy from 90 to 30, you see it's not rising up. It's too low of a force based on our heat we generate. So if I increase that to 200, we will have a lot of buoyancy and the hot thing will rise really fast. So let me just put that back to 100 maybe. And we have this nice rolling mushroom cloud. So that looks good. Then the last parameter here of the important set is our cooling rate. We can increase the cooling rate. Let me just increase it to a high value. So what happens? It cools down, so nothing is there anymore to burn or create any burn. So it's already dead. The cooling effect controls naturally how our shape looks like. So that's really fast cool down. I'll reduce it to 1. So now it cools down much slower, and we get to this height. And if I go smaller, like our original setting, we rise really high because the cooling is very slow. So that's the cooling setting that gives us this control over our mushroom cloud. And in the fading and damping, I'm using only one important part, that's the velocity damping. And that's kind of a friction. And that's also what happens with the nuclear explosion. In the beginning, we have so much power an overabundance of power that we have a very fast expansion, but then friction takes over and it goes slower, and the same in the rising up, it goes slower. So the velocity damping is kind of a friction. So I could increase the friction. Let me just increase it to 0.9, which is extreme right now. So we have a little bit of rising happening, and now it gets instantly slower, slower, slower. The friction is very high. The other way around, if we have no friction at all, we would have a linear or even a speeding up movement like a gas explosion, fuel explosion. We don't want that. We want, for sure, we want to simulate something like an A-bomb that gets slower and slower as it reaches the higher regions of our atmosphere. So something like that. Maybe we can bump it up to 0.5 so that it gets slower and slower at the end when it rises up. So that's beautiful. Nice. So that's what we have here. And the last thing you always want to check, probably first, but depends how much memory you have, is our sparsity. And as I mentioned, we use a sparse grid solver. That means we only create voxels where it's needed, but we need to tell the system what we want. So let me just turn on our debug window, which is very important and you should always do. Right now, we have a pretty good tight set around. The voxels are around where things happen. You always have to have a buffer because motion can go in all directions. So you need to have a little bit of a buffer around your effect. But what we see here is a really perfect setup, tight around the effect we want to have. So let me explain what we do now. So we have wherever there's fuel, so I set this to 1, wherever there's fuel, I want to have a voxel. Wherever there's temperature, I want to have a voxel. Wherever there's smoke, I want to have a voxel. So now let me just remove the smoke voxels. I've set that to 0. Now watch what happens. So now we have no more smoke here and it kills the voxels. No smoke, voxels gone. So I want to make sure whenever I have even the slightest bit smoke left, I want to keep my stem here. So voxels are not killed, or smoke voxels are not killed. And the same is true for temperature and fuel. Wherever I have a little bit of temperature, I want that. We could turn off temperature because right now the smoke is very dominant in that effect, but we could just use temperature, for example. Wherever there's the slightest bit of temperature, we want to have voxels. And the same for fuel. Wherever there's fuel, we want to have voxels. Now let me show you something that would be really bad if you would set it up like that. I'll turn on my velocity. So now I want voxels wherever there's velocity. And that means prediction is now our dominant driving force, because velocity means it needs to look at neighbor voxels. And whenever there's a potential there could be velocity in there, it's very sensitive. So let me just show you. Right now you can see I have a very high value, which practically turns it off. But when I set it to 0, watch what happens. It fills up all the space until there's no more memory. You can see here, there's no more memory. And we are lucky that all our effects are in the center. If we had the effect here, it would not work because there's no more allocation left. So now we wasted all our memory in these areas. And you can see now we get these blocks. So whenever you see these blocky things, that means there's no more memory left. So what you need to make sure is put a high velocity value there so that only when there's really important things happening, you get this. But right now, I don't need that. All the other effects are strong enough to create our voxels around. So that's the voxels thing. Now I want to show you something extra that is also an interesting way to control and work with it. So let me just close this here. As I mentioned in my introduction, we have this wind force. Let me just set that to planar. And let me just rotate the wind force. We have that here. And just rotate it to this direction. And move that up. Come on. And we move it in that direction. So what we have here is a wind blowing from left to right. And now what we do is we just add, let me just go in here, the wind force. And now I want to show you, let me pick the wind. Now let me show you what we can do with the wind. But it's also very finicky and tricky to use wind force. That's a standard wind force of 3D Studio Max, by the way. Let me just bring up our real-time preview, and then we can see what's happening. So we get weird stuff going on here. So the weird stuff we see here is because we have the decay on, and now we can blow away our bomb and something happens down here. I'll explain in a second what that means. So now the wind is blowing our bomb to the right. So obviously the wind is way too strong. And now we have this nice effect here. So what's happening with these soil effects? Let me just go to the bomb and turn off the bomb for a second and only work on the ground soil effect. So let's have a look at the ground soil. The ground soil already has the vorticity and the forces are adding up. So we have the wind force and the vorticity, and that makes it freak out. So it's always a good idea to turn off the vorticity so that only the wind is affecting our smoke here. So let me turn on our bomb here. So now we have our really nice wind blowing the smoke and the bomb effect away. It's still too strong, but let's just keep it for now so that we can see what's going on. Now, what I like about the wind is it has its own turbulence. So we can add a turbulence here. Let me just add a turbulence, let's say 10 for a start, frequency 2, and probably a scale of 500. So now we have an added turbulence here. And let me just increase the turbulence value a little bit more. And we can see it adds much more detail to our effect. Let me just increase it even more. We can see it's now much more finer detail in here. And the turbulence is really strong. We could also turn off our wind and still keep the turbulence. And now let me just show you how it looks like when we reduce the size. Let me go back to 10, for example. Then we get really tiny details, really tiny spikes. Or how about 0.5? And now we get some totally crazy effects. You would use that for gasoline explosions. But with this turbulence, you can really mess up all the voxels in a way you really want and want to create. So we can reduce probably the strength of the turbulence. And maybe go here. Something like that. And this just adds more detail to our, so we don't have to increase our resolution just by mixing around more our cold smoke and everything with this little thing adds more details. And then make the effect larger so that it doesn't destroy our initial shape. And then we can say, okay, make this a little bit stronger. And then we can get this kind of extra detail in here. So that's really nice and powerful feature we can add here with the standard wind force from 3D Studio Max. And also keep in mind, we still have our wind here. So the wind can also affect our mushroom cloud, and it's blowing away in the wind. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have to show you. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you learned some new tricks with finalFluid. It's a very powerful real-time fire and smoke effect. We have a free public beta that allows you to do all the things you just saw. So download the free version and work with it in 3D Studio Max. Just grab it, play around. I'm sure you will love it. And it's especially useful for these fast real-time effects you want to place there. You have an explosion of a car, gasoline going off. It's really that straightforward and easy. So thank you for watching this tutorial. Please remember, subscribe and like the video, press the bell button. Thank you so much for your support, and goodbye.